One of the realities of life is whenever something becomes popular, there will be no shortage of knockoffs, variants, and other things trying to attach itself to try and make a buck by proxy. Transformers had the GoBots and Rock Lords, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had Biker Mice from Mars, Stone Protectors, Battletoads, and what have you, and in the late 90s, nothing was hotter than professional wrestling. So of course, a lot of people had to come along and try to attach that popularity to things that weren't necessarily professional wrestling themselves. The result was non-wrestling shows using wrestling themes. And in this special episode of Exploder, we're going to look at one such thing I call wrestling-like. It's going to be RollerJam. RollerJam was a creation of Ross K. Bagwell and Stephen Land of Pageboy Entertainment. They pitched the idea to TNN, then the Nashville Network, in 1998. The company would later become the National Network, bring in WWE programming and ECW programming. TNN liked the idea, but they wanted it done by Christmas of that year. So that gave them 7 months to build a league, a track, use a soundstage, cast, and put a show on the air that was good enough for the network. But then again, considering up to that point, the network was mostly Dukes of Hazzard reruns, I don't think the bar was that high. RollerJam was an attempt to modernize roller derby after the first national exposure that roller derby had seen since the early 90s with roller games. RollerJam was an attempt to modernize it using inline or rollerblade skates, although other players could actually use the old skates through a grandfather rule, which didn't make a whole lot of sense, but they made it up. They created the roster, they cast everyone, they created the teams, the World Skating League, they hired commissioners and interviewers. They built this from scratch in, again, 7 months. One thing that would make this different from previous iterations of roller derby was that they were integrating pro wrestling like storylines into roller derby. So instead of just a regular roller derby match or game that would end with a little bit of bruising, they would actually integrate over the top storylines and characters and gimmicks and things of that sort, as was the norm at the time. They would record in Soundstage 21 in Universal Studios, Florida. If you're a nerd and Soundstage 21 at Universal sounds familiar, that's because the same soundstage would later become the home of TNA Impact, which itself would be a company that resembled wrestling but wasn't quite up to snuff. RollerJam would air on TNN from 1999 to 2001 in the middle of the transition between the Nashville Network and the National Network. They were often treated as a key figure of their Friday night lineup, sometimes and usually even being the show that ECW led into. So ECW on TNN was treated in some people's eyes as a lead-in for the RollerJam show. So Roller Derby was taking the lead in a Friday night action show or an action night where ECW was sort of being treated as lesser than, or at least that's how some people felt. The entire league, the entire show is based on something called the World Skating League, which of course was created exclusively for the show. It didn't exist outside of the show. It consists of teams like the LA Quake, the Illinois Riot, the New York Enforcers, the Florida Sundogs, the Texas Rustlers, and the Nevada Hot Dice. Talent rosters would change and switch between seasons, sometimes without any explanation. Someone who would play, like Mike Barker, who would skate for the Sundogs, would end up on the Enforcers, and then he'd end up on the Riot, and there was never an explanation. But then again, when you own the league and the teams, you can do whatever you want. They hired characters like Broadway Danny Wolf to be the trackside reporter, and managers often had characters. Richard Brown was called the King, and why was he called that? Because he wore a suit and carried a briefcase and a king hat, and literally in one race he raced wearing the king hat, the crown. It made no sense, but that's what they did. But of all the copycats and similar things trying to attach to professional wrestling, why did this show last from 1999 to 2001 in a transition of a network from a regional Monster Trucks and Dukes of Hazzard reruns to a national network that said the phrase, "We've got pop"? Why did it last that long even in that transition? Well, partially because it attached to the right thing. Roller derby has been in popularity up and down since the 50s, as far as I know. It's not really been a major thing. Everyone's going to watch football, basketball, baseball, but roller derby was sort of a regional thing, and certain people liked it and certain people didn't. This was an attempt to modernize it, to bring it to the modern day, and what they did was they did the flash and the pizzazz and the characters and the showmanship of professional wrestling on a smaller budget. They did this so with an evil commissioner, Kenneth Logue III, who was actually an actor, and I cannot find a picture of him as the commissioner because finding actual images, you'll notice that some of these images are very, if you're watching the video portion, some of these videos are very low quality, but man, these were shot in before HD in the late 90s, and you have to find them online. So some of them are going to be smaller, some are compilations. I'm sorry for the quality, but you know, this wasn't shot in HD, and if it was, I think you'd probably be horrified by some of the stuff you'd see. because these weren't movie stars, these were roller derby people, and maybe HD isn't great for them. But anyway, so I can't find a picture of the guy as commissioner, but he was Kenneth Logue III, so he played, and he was really clean cut. And then actually right now I'm going to put up his IMDb photo as an actor, and I'll look at it right now. He didn't look anything like this, so he was kind of the opposite. So these were literally people playing characters. But why did it exist? Because people were playing characters. They weren't just roller derby people. They weren't just skaters. They were characters on their own. So like I said, they integrated inline skates, rollerblades, whatever you want to call them, but certain people were allowed to use the old, what they called quads, or traditional skates as you all know them. Some of them are older, like the King Richard Brown, who was the manager of the Illinois Riot, but was also a racer whenever it was convenient. The quad father, Mike D'Amata, the leader of the New York Enforcers. I will explain that one, because that one gets interesting. Ray Robles, who actually skated in roller games in the late 80s, early 90s, whose entire gimmick apparently was throwing chili powder in people's eyes. Again, I wish I was joking on that. And they were grandfathered, and they were allowed to wear the skates, probably because they couldn't do the inlines. They only could do the skates, and that was just an easy way to explain it. But the characters, there was Shea Brown for the Nevada Hot Dice. She was the, quote, the warrior princess. Each team would have a group of people within the team. There'd be a male team and a female team, and even within those groups, there was the Bod Squad on the LA Quakes. There was Loden and Gunner, and Gunnin were members of the Oral Authority on the Illinois Riot, I believe they were. And so you had this group of people. They'd give them names, they give them characters, and it was really interesting. It wasn't, so what does that have to do with wrestling? Well, it wasn't wrestling, but it was like a small-time indie federation, indie promotion put on roller skates, if that makes any sense. And it's weird, and it was this weird part of pop culture that, like I said, the reason I'm featuring it here, because it is wrestling-like. It's not quite wrestling, but it's close, and I think that's, for the time, it's something very specific and very interesting. I think it's something I just wanted to cover. Teams certainly had a character all their own. There were babyface teams and heel teams. The Nevada Hot Dice and the LA Quake were primarily the babyface teams. The LA Quake was the babyface team. If you had to pick an Austin, that was the Austin. Other teams like the Illinois Riot and the New York Enforcers were the heel teams, and the New York Enforcers were the heel team, being led by Mark D'Amata, who was the heel of the thing, of the whole league. That would play out later, and again, I'll get to that. There was a particular story with those two teams that was very interesting, and it was, for what it was good. It was low quality, but for what it was really good, but I'll get to that. Other characters included Mo Sanders, who, in addition to having cheetah-like hair, look at the picture, he was also known for being incredibly fast, arrogant, maybe like a Deion Sanders type. Like I said, Ray Robles, there was Mark Webber and Jason McDaniel. They called themselves the X-Men, I believe. They were younger. They were part of the Nevada Hot Dice, and they were a good team. Shea Brown. There was the Hellcat Talisa Miller, who was known for being one of the more vicious women on the team. I think she wore like cat contact lenses, which looked scary, but then again, she also looked like a soccer mom that forgot to pick her kids up and just spent her afternoons just beating the crap out of 20-year-olds. So, hey, it's a good job if you can get it. But the lead character was probably Mark D'Amata, who was the leader of the New York Enforcers, who was really a brash. He looked like if Goldberg aged 20 years in like a day. He looked kind of like that, but he was the best heel, and he was a great heel, and he was good at playing the role. He was the guy that you just hated, and he knew that, and he played it up to the hilt. And it was a guy that you knew, if he wasn't in roller derby, he would have been a great wrestler, but as far as I know, he never became one. He was always a roller derby guy, but he adapted to this heel character very easily. The other side was Sean Atkinson, the Ack Attack, as they called him. He was the primary babyface. Now, he comes from roller derby royalty, if you follow it that much. I don't, but I do know this part of it. Both his grandparents and parents were in roller derby, so he was, for roller derby's sake, the first third-generation superstar, I guess, and he appeared on this as like the primary babyface, being the captain of the LA Quake, which was the primary babyface team. They even had basically jobber teams, like the Florida Sundogs and the Texas Rustlers. To be honest with you, until I was researching this, and I used to watch this show, I forgot the Texas Rustlers even existed. That's how little they appeared on TV. They existed, but I had no idea. So I knew about the Sundogs because the Sundogs played an important role in later seasons, but they were basically jobbers. They were the guys who came in and lost every match against the bigger name teams. Another thing they integrated weird things like weapons. Like every once in a while, someone would like leave the bank track, come out with a trash can or a chair or something ridiculous and hit a guy. They'd knock him over the rail, and it really got. They actually brought in the guy who was the son of Leo Seltzer, who invented roller derby, and they had him on, and he actually left after the first season because he thought it was too TV, it was too wrestling and not enough roller derby, so it sort of disaffected. So the old traditional roller derby fans probably hate this, and I don't blame them. I mean, if you grew up with one thing, if you grew up with football and one day someone comes along and they slam, they hit a quarterback with a ladder, you're not gonna like that as much. So I understand that conflict, but again, I'm not a huge roller derby fan, but for this show on its own, it served its purpose. There was Big Nasty Tim Washington. There was Brian Gamble, two guys who actually left after this was done. Tim Washington ended up working on American Gladiators. Well, he was in American Gladiators before this, and then he ended up on RollerJam. Brian Gamble went the other way. Brian Gamble he was a competitor on American Gladiators, went to RollerJam, and then after it became a pro wrestler, being trained by Dory Funk Jr. of all people. And he was a jobber in both the WWE and TNA. So there was right there is two guys who go from RollerJam to professional wrestling in a very unique way. That's a weird pipeline, but it makes sense if you think about it. Other characters would be sort of this nondescript guy named Mike Barker, who the whole gimmick ended up being almost this jobber type because he skated, I'm pretty sure, for almost every team. Sometimes in the middle of a season, he would skate for the Sundogs, he'd on the Enforcers, he was on the Hot Dice for a game or two. His whole thing was he never found a team, so he was always playing a team. It could have just been an extra thing, but they turned it into a character. Eric Slopey, that they called Slope Dog, known for his speed, but also, as they told it, was he was actually a high school student in the local area, and he skated there on weekends or something, like when they would film, and then he would go back to high school. Like, he had braces. Like, if that tells you, he had braces doing this, so he was actually pretty young. There were all these different characters. They were all different, and it was really a good thing for what it was. They would do gimmicks with ladders and tables, and they would have this thing called the Destruction Derby, which once a year, it was like their WrestleMania. If WrestleMania was held in a bingo hall in Dubuque, but they would do it where they would do tables matches and all these things. They would integrate that into roller derby. So I get the traditionalists sort of spinning in their graves, but again, for what it was fine. I mean, you had characters and they did it, but then when they started integrating other things, they integrated the thing called the Prophet. They hired a guy in who was not a skater, and they brought him in, and he was the Prophet. And the Prophet was a guy who took over the Florida Sundogs, which was at the time, again, like the jobber version of the whole league. And he ended up taking over the league. He kidnapped a girl named Lindsay Francis, who skated at one, I don't know who she skated for at that time, but kidnapped her and then made her his girlfriend or whatever. It was like a cult, and there was a cult on a roller derby team, and to the point where he took over the league, and then there was this whole plan to beat him in a match to where he would leave the league. It was this whole thing. The guy actually ended up being a sports broadcaster, so that's sort of a weird thing. But yeah, so then when they would do these over-the-top storylines, one of them involved Mark D'Amata and Sean Atkinson, the biggest heel and the biggest babyface, and the whole storyline went around to somewhere along the way, Sean Atkinson's father had a child out of wedlock, and that child supposedly, through a DNA test which was performed by, and I'm not joking here, a nurse wearing almost like a naughty nurse outfit. Like, it was the most over-the-top ridiculous thing ever. So like they went to a Halloween shop, picked up the sluttiest thing they could find, and acted like she was a real nurse. And the DNA test found that Sean Atkinson and Mark D'Amata were siblings. So Sean Atkinson falls for this eventually, and realizing this is his brother that he never knew, that he hated up to this moment, joins him on the New York Enforcers and helps him defeat, I think this was the Prophet, helps him defeat the Prophet. And the whole storyline ended up with, this was Mark D'Amata, and then Mark D'Amata explains that he paid off the DNA sample, or he paid off the person taking the DNA test, including the slutty nurse, to get Sean Atkinson to believe he was his brother so that he could win ownership of the New York Enforcers. So theoretically, he was the captain of the New York Enforcers, but this whole drawn out storyline that went almost the entire season was to win ownership of a roller derby team inside a fake league on a television show. That's the kind of wrestling they were doing in the middle of roller derby, and that was the weird stuff. The final angle, the final story was was about Lisa Seltzer, who again was not Lisa Seltzer, is not anyone related to Leo Seltzer, who created roller derby, but a actress who was coming in to create a all-star team that was going to go skate in the roller derby world championships. By the way, something that does not exist, and that she was going to handpick skaters from the World Skating League to go on this tour. And the whole angle was around players on teams even competing against each other to get the eye of this Lisa Seltzer, who just showed up one day in the crowd. So that angle never was finished because they actually got canceled in 2001 before they could finish it. So you have this thing where they're going to build toward this angle. Where it was going to go, I don't know. And then it just disappeared. I mean, it was like watching a bunch of angles from TNA, because you know there's a finish, you know someone probably wrote one, and then you never see it. And in this one, we actually wanted to see it, so it was weird that we didn't. So yeah. So again, how did this translate to pro wrestling? It translated to pro wrestling because it was like wrestling, but it wasn't. It was something where it was sort of like a parody of wrestling. And I think, honestly, if you watch it, it was very earnest. They meant it to be honest, but it was done by people that didn't quite know how to do it. So it was like someone trying to do a wrestling show who'd never been to a wrestling show. So it was like Vince Russo. Well, it was like Vince Russo in WCW almost. It was like that level of cheese. It was it was just awful, and I can't explain it. But why did I want to do this episode? I want to do this episode because I wanted to show you certain things. Wrestling pervaded our reality at that time. In 1999, 2000, 2001, it pervaded, and even into the mid-90s, from 97 on, it pervaded pop culture in a way that very few things actually do. Every time there's a knockoff, the variant, or something like that, pro wrestling had its own. I mean, and from video games, TV shows, and things that weren't necessarily even wrestling were attaching itself to wrestling. And sometimes the results can be okay, and sometimes the results are backyard wrestling video games. I still hate those. But anyway, that said, so I want to do this episode. This is a special one. I know there wasn't a lot of wrestling content on this one. Hope you bear with me. Next episode, I don't know what I'm going to cover, but I'm going to go back to regular wrestling. I might come back to this wrestling-like stuff later on in different variants, but this was the one that was on top of my mind, and this is the one that I just wanted to share with you off the top of my head. So, until next time, I'm Dan. This is Exploder. Have a good one.